Corbyn wants the PM's tax affairs investigated in the light of the Panama leaks. Cameron insists he and his family are in the clear.
I have no shares, no offshore trusts, no offshore funds, nothing like that.
But the global scandal costs the Icelandic Prime Minister his job.
Also tonight, Angela writes in a destitute alcoholic murdered by two troubled girls barely in their teens.
The man who might rescue Tata Steel sets out his stall to the government and says jobs can be saved.
And the Lovebirds, separated by the trauma of war, reunited in their 90s.
This is the ITV Evening News with Alistair Stewart and Ranveer Singh.
Good evening. David Cameron insisted neither he nor his wife and children benefited from any controversial offshore holdings. He said he only had a salary, a house and some savings. His late father was named in the leak from a Panamanian law firm as having established a tax-efficient offshore trust.
Despite that denial, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn still wants an independent investigation into the scandal which today claimed the job of Iceland's Prime Minister. Our political correspondent Libby Wiener reports.
A private matter, said Number 10 yesterday, trying to deflect questions about whether David Cameron benefited from his late father Ian's offshore investment fund. But today, visiting an accountancy firm in Birmingham, the Prime Minister did agree to take one question about his personal finances. They were, he said, entirely above board.
I own no shares. I have a salary as Prime Minister and I have some savings, which I get some interest from, and I have a house which we used to live in, which we now let out while we're living in Downing Street. And that's all I have. I have no shares, no offshore trusts, no offshore funds, nothing like that.
Ian Cameron was a director of an investment fund called Blairmore Holdings. He lived in Berkshire, but the company was based in the Bahamas, which allowed it to avoid UK tax. To keep the company legally above board, 6 other directors were recruited in the Bahamas and Switzerland. But the leaked papers raise questions about their involvement in strategy and decision-making. The Prime Minister may believe that he said all he needs to say about his own tax affairs, but he wouldn't comment today on his wider family or say whether he thought what his father had done was in any way ethical. Labour are now calling for a full investigation.
It's not a private matter if tax has not been paid, and so an investigation must take place, independent investigation, unprejudiced, to decide whether or not tax is owed or not.
But do you think the PM should disclose it?
I think the Prime Minister, in his own interest, ought to tell us exactly what's been going on.
Elsewhere, the fallout from the leak of millions of documents from this Panama law firm continues. In Iceland, thousands came out in protest after allegations that the Prime Minister failed to declare shares hidden in a tax haven. This afternoon, Sigmunda Gunnlaugsson resigned, the first major casualty of the Panama Papers. What's happened to the investment company founded by David Cameron's late father and mentioned in those papers is still unclear. All we know for sure is that the Prime Minister himself does not benefit from its activities.
Libby, in your view, has the Prime Minister done enough to distance his family from these leaks?
Well, I think, to be frank, I don't think he actually has. Within the last hour or so, Number 10 have been forced to clarify those comments he made earlier today here in Birmingham, where he said he himself hadn't benefited in any way from any offshore investment. Number 10 said late this afternoon that he was also talking about his wife and children in that regard. His wife, though, does hold some shares relating to her father's land. I have to say, until he also makes any comment on his father's actual investment fund, I think the questions will still keep coming. There is no suggestion that what Ian Cameron was doing with that company in the Bahamas was illegal, but I think many people would think that it wasn't very ethical to try and help people reduce their tax liabilities, and we've yet to hear what the Prime Minister thinks about that.
Libby, thank you.
Two teenaged girls have been found guilty of savagely beating to death a frail and vulnerable woman in her own home. The pair, who were aged 13 and 14 at the time, attacked Angela Wrightson over several hours at a house in Hartlepool. Detectives said they'd never come across a case involving such young girls. And a warning now that this report from Peter Smith has details of the attack.
Angela Wrightson had a short life and she endured more than her share of suffering. She had a troubled upbringing in care. As an adult, she was an alcoholic. Children in Hartlepool used to get her to buy them alcohol. Aged 39, she was violently murdered in her own living room by two teenage girls.
And she was attacked and brutally murdered in her own home, a place where we all have the right to feel safe. Listening to the details of her injuries and of her final moments have been a harrowing experience and something which we will never ever forget and will continue to haunt us every day.
This footage, taken from the night of the attack, shows Angela buying alcohol for the two girls who were about to murder her. They were only 13 and 14 at the time, and just like their victim, both had been through a life of care. This picture, drawn by one of the girls, gives an insight into their troubled mindsets.
My experience, I've never ever come across a case like this before, with female offenders like this, and the fact that they were young girls.
In this picture from CCTV, the girls have just left Angela's home after a sustained attack, as brutal as it was cold. Police say they used a television and coffee table to beat her. Then, at 4 in the morning, they called police to report themselves missing and get a lift home.
You tell me how long we're going to be on treason.
There's no need to be swearing, ringing up and swearing and going on like that. What's your name?
I'm called.
This horrific murder happened in a street that's known to police. One of Angela's neighbours told me it is a tough area.
During the summer, she was always on the step. A lot of friends around, so-called friends, because they were all drinking. They were just basically drinking associates. Kids would go around because there's nothing else for them to do. She'd go to the shop for them, she'd buy the drink.
Did people take advantage of her?
I'd say people definitely took advantage of her.
Serious case reviews will now look into what lessons can be learned from this and whether anything went wrong in the system that allowed a vulnerable adult to be murdered by two vulnerable children.
And Peter joins us now, and of course the question is, how on earth was this allowed to happen?
That's right, there are now case reviews looking into this. One adult review regarding Angela Wrightson. She was a known figure in this area, in many ways a sad figure. People here tell me she'd made 999 calls as a cry for help. On one occasion she lay on the road waiting for emergency services to come and collect her. Her home here had effectively turned into a drinking den for local teenagers, this despite the fact that she had a helper to help look after her welfare. And then of course there is the case review looking into the two teenage girls. They will be sentenced on Thursday, but the question is, how on earth did they end up in the home of a woman who could barely look after herself, never mind two vulnerable teenage girls?
Peter Smith in Hartlepool, thank you.
The man who says he can save Tata Steel and its thousands of UK jobs met the Business Secretary Sanjeev Javid today. Millionaire steelman Sanjeev Gupta set out his terms and later said he was encouraged by the government's response.
Tonight, Mr Javid flies to Mumbai for face-to-face talks with the global boss of Tata. Time, though, is of the essence. Tata say they are losing £1 million a day. Juliet Bremner has more.
The one man who may be able to throw the British steel industry a lifeline. Sanjeev Gupta was given VIP treatment as he arrived at the Department of Business today. He made it clear in an interview with Channel 4 News that there would have to be changes.
We need to change the technology or the process in which steel is made in this country, from smelting it using imported raw material to melting it or recycling it using local scrap, which is readily available.
His vision would see the blast furnace at Port Talbot replaced with a new, greener arc furnace, recycling scrap that's currently sold abroad. Before he does a deal, Sanjeev Gupta has 3 non-negotiable conditions. He wants to avoid all pension liabilities, totalling a massive £14.5 billion. The government and Tata would have to pick up this bill. He also wants the government to ensure against any possible environmental damage or losses between now and the takeover. and he wouldn't accept a deal unless steel production was exempt from any green energy costs levied by the government. Despite his fierce glare, the First Minister of Wales was reassured by the Prime Minister all these points could be considered.
The government's anxious to make sure any potential buyer knows it's on board with this deal. But Mr Gupta is looking for some very specific guarantees in relation to pension deficit and environmental costs. And it's far from certain that the financial help on offer is going to satisfy those requests.
Brokering a deal is the job of Business Secretary Sajid Javid, on his way to India tonight to ask Tata how much it can do to save steel jobs before pulling out of Britain. Juliet Bremner, ITV News.
Evidence linking the late serial killer Robert Black to the murder of a 13-year-old girl has been handed to prosecutors. Jeanette Tate went missing in Devon in 1978 and her body has never been found. Police were close to charging Black with her murder when he died in prison in January.
And a man has pleaded guilty to the rape and murder of a 15-year-old girl in Leicestershire. Kaylee Hayward's body was discovered near a lake 5 days after she went missing. Stephen Beedman admitted those charges today but denied a charge of false imprisonment.
Greece has not returned any migrants to Turkey on what would have been the second day of a new deal to tackle the crisis. And there are reports from Turkey that none are now expected to be sent there until Friday. Our Europe editor James Mates is on the island of Lesbos, from where many migrants were returned yesterday. James, what are you reading into this delay?
Well, that yesterday really was the easy day and that this whole process is not going to be smooth or in any way regular. In fairness, I think the Greeks have always known that. They've always refrained from making any prediction that there would be a regular return each day of a certain number of migrants. But on the other hand, none today, possibly none till Friday. That does suggest a hiatus bigger than even they were expecting. And the problem does seem to be that many hundreds, if not thousands, are claiming asylum, which they all have the right to do. Each claim will take at least 2 weeks, maybe double that to process. Officials have been swamped by the large numbers and it may be a while before this all gets going again. There were also signs today of growing anger among the migrants and refugees, a protest at the main detention centre here on Lesbos, a sit-down protest by several hundred, mostly young men, demanding freedom, as they put it, and not to be sent back to Turkey. Well, I think that what that suggests is that the pictures we saw yesterday, which was of a relatively orderly return of a large number without any signs of resistance, that may, in this process, turn out to be the exception rather than the rule.
James, thank you.
Still to come, dog owners beware why new rules could cost you dear.
This is what it's all about, a tiny microchip. It goes between the shoulder blades in a process that should take just a couple of seconds.
And how a love lost to war has been rekindled 70 years on. That story and more after the break.
Welcome back. The final members of a 14-strong gang were jailed today for robberies 4 times bigger than that of the Hatton Garden raid. This gang stole rare Chinese artefacts and rhino horn worth £57 million from museums and auction houses across Britain. It's thought they were stolen to order for buyers in China, and many items will never be recovered. Richard Pallow reports on the plot.
This was some of the gang on their way to rob the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, just minutes later driving away with a near priceless collection of antiques. Many of the 18 pieces of Chinese jade are still missing, probably sold on the Far East auction market. Worth tens of millions of pounds at a guess, a far bigger haul than the Hatton Garden heist, and in this raid at least, with a similar level of professionalism.
Jade is so revered by the Chinese and has been for 2,500 years, and there's a lot of money out there searching for it. And these items, if you imagine, they are extremely valuable. They're not available on the open market readily, and so a haul like this would find, I'm afraid, a very big market.
The rest of the thefts, though, were amateur and inept. The pair that stole an 18th century Chinese bowl and figurine from Durham's Oriental Museum buried them in a nearby field, but later couldn't remember exactly where. And when other members of the 14-man gang stole a rhino horn in Norwich, they took the whole head and then dropped it as it was too heavy, and staff gave pursuit. But they were all low-level operators recruited by the 4 men running it. DNA evidence leading police to 3 brothers and an accomplice, all linked to the town of Rathkeel in the Republic of Ireland.
These people were just fall guys for them, and that's why I think they're very cowardly, the people who hired them and recruited them, and that's why I'm really pleased that we've been able to bring them to justice as well, rather than just the individuals who actually carried out the crimes.
The Fitzwilliam Museum in particular remains hardest hit, with the judge warning there is no prospect of the recovery of any of the missing artefacts. Richard Pallow, ITV News.
It's estimated that more than 1 million dogs have still not been microchipped ahead of a new law that comes into force tomorrow. Owners in England face a fine of hundreds of pounds if they don't comply. Some oppose the scheme, but, as our consumer editor Chris Choi found out, it often helps reunite missing dogs with their owners.
Looking for a new owner, or perhaps her old ones. At Birmingham Dogs Home, they start the process by scanning for a microchip. They say it's the best hope for many of the pets they see here.
I think it's important to have compulsory microchipping because it just helps us to be able to reunite the lost dogs with the owners quicker. We have seen cases of them being reunited. We phone them up straight away. That gets them down to collect them.
This is what it's all about, a tiny microchip about the size of a grain of rice. It goes between the shoulder blades in a process that should take just a couple of seconds.
Good boy.
Each chip carries a 15-digit code that links to a name and address, and here's how it's done.
Good boy.
100,000 dogs are lost or abandoned each year. The new rules mean any over 8 weeks must be microchipped. Owners found not to have complied will be given 21 days to do so, after which they could face a £500 fine. But this vet says the new rules are hard to police and potentially ineffective.
The problem is, if you have a litter of puppies and you chip the puppies and you sell the puppies, who is responsible for ensuring that the new owners keep their stuff up to date? It's not going to stop backstreet breeders or accidental litters.
Today, this family had an emotional reunion. Their pet has been missing for 4 months. They're back together thanks to its microchip.
If he wasn't microchipped, we wouldn't have seen him again. There's no way he could have been traced back to us, so I'm really happy.
I feel happy.
It may prove hard for opponents of microchipping to argue with happy endings like this. Chris Choi, ITV News, Birmingham Dogs Home.
NHS England says almost 25,000 operations have been cancelled because of strikes by junior doctors. Tomorrow's industrial action will be the 4th time they've walked out in a dispute over a new contract.
And a military dog who lost a leg in Afghanistan has been honoured with the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross. Luca was working with US Marines when an explosive device detonated in 2012. The German Shepherd received the Dickin Medal at a ceremony in London today. And finally tonight, when D-Day veteran Roy Vickerman returned home after the war, like many, he was deeply traumatised. Sadly, it saw him split up with his fiancée, something he regretted for decades.
But a chance call to a local radio station 70 years later led to the pair reuniting, and now they are finally going to tie the knot. They told Neil Connery how true love never dies.
I've been so happy though, haven't I?
You have, yeah.
Ever since you came.
You have, yeah.
I have.
Nora Jackson and Roy Vickerman are picking up where they left off. They got engaged the week before Roy saw action on D-Day, but their wedding plans were left shattered after he was shot by a German sniper and suffered mental trauma. They went their own ways, marrying and having families. But after Roy's wife died 4 years ago, he tracked Nora down through a radio show, turning up on her doorstep with a bunch of flowers.
Well, I thought I was going to get a black eye, quite frankly, because I didn't know whether Nora's husband was still around.
But Nora, like Roy, was widowed, and she was overwhelmed seeing him again after 70 years.
There stood Roy. I went to him. I kissed him.
Yes, you did, too.
And I asked him if he'd just hold me, because it was so wonderful, you know. Could hardly believe it.
They were soon talking marriage, and Roy proposed with the same engagement ring from 70 years ago. One couple who say love conquers all, and it's never too late. Neil Connery, ITV News, Stoke-on-Trent.
I've never seen anything lovelier. It's absolutely gorgeous. OK, that's all for now. Tom Bradby's here with the news at 10.
From all of us, bye-bye.
Right.